Hello and welcome. Today's tutorial is how to create a Biscornu. The pattern that you see in this tutorial is the Abuzz Biscornu, and it is my newest pattern that you can find at stitchingbookclub.com. However, you are more than welcome to use this tutorial to finish whichever pattern for a Biscornu that you would like. So let's go ahead and get started. So obviously the first step of creating a Biscornu is to complete your two pieces of cross stitch. And you want them to be square, you want them to be the same size, and for this tutorial you want them to have an odd numbered stitch count. Next, you want to make sure to complete a row of back stitching completely around the entire design. These are just single back stitches all the way around. And for this tutorial, it's really important that the corners be clipped corners. So this is a single back stitch that goes diagonally across this final stitching space rather than creating a squared corner. And you want to do this to all of your corners on both the front piece and the back piece of stitching. If you are working on the Abuzz Biscornu, this is actually written directly into the pattern. Now, before we sew them together, we need to prepare the fabric, and I'm going to start by trimming these edges. So I'm going to cut an approximately 1/4 inch seam allowance here, and that puts me about 3 stitching spaces out. If you are working on even weave, you might want to do a little bit more, maybe 9 to 10 fibers, just because even weave is going to fray a little bit more than Aida, and you want to make sure that your piece isn't falling apart. So now that all of our sides, both pieces of cross stitch, have been trimmed, we are going to go ahead and finger press these edges right against the back stitch line. So I'm just using my fingers to press this inward, and I'm going to miter the corners by folding the corner inward diagonally against that diagonal back stitch that we have at the corners, and then I will fold the side pieces down against that corner piece. And by doing it this way, we're going to end up with a nice mitered corner, and that's just going to make for a little cleaner finishing. So I'm just going to continue pressing all of these seams, and I want to do this to all sides and all corners of both pieces. Now that both of our pieces are prepared, we can go ahead and start sewing them together. And the way that we're going to do this is we are going to line up the corner of one of our pieces with the center of a side of the other piece. So I'm going to go ahead and get my floss. I like to use loop starch, so I have a single piece of floss that I've folded in half, both ends threaded through the needle, and this gives me a loop at the end. And I'm going to attach it to my first piece of fabric at the center of one side. And I know that this little motif here is the center, so I'm just going to come down and figure about the center. I'm not too picky right here because I'm just attaching my floss, and I'm just going to run my needle under one of the completed cross stitches on the back side, and then I'm going to put the loop from my working floss over my needle and pull through, and my floss will now be loop started onto the back side of my fabric. So I now need to put the needle up at the center back stitch on this side. So I'm just kind of looking to see exactly where my center is, and then I'm going to put my needle up just above that back stitch. So I'm just above that back stitch. I'm on the side of the cross stitching. As you can see, the needle's just above on the side of the cross stitching, and I'm pulling through. And now I am going to take my needle And I just want to verify one more time that I am in fact at the center, because this is very important. You have to get this first stitch lined up perfectly in order to get the Biscornu right. So I'm just verifying that yes, I am at the center back stitch. And now that I'm sure, I'm going to run my needle under that back stitch, and I'm running my needle outward away from my cross stitching. And I'm going to take my second piece of fabric and I'm going to connect it with the corner stitch of this piece. So I'm going to run my needle under that diagonal corner back stitch on this second piece of fabric. And I'm running my needle inward toward my cross stitching. And now I'm just going to pull through, and this is our first stitch of sewing the two pieces together. And as you can see, this first stitch, it's pretty sloppy, it's very loose. You need to kind of work to hold it together until you get the next few stitches in, but then it will become much more secure. So as you can see, my corner is now connected to the center of the first side of cross stitching. So I'm going to take my needle now, and I'm going to go one back stitch to the left of that corner stitch that we just went through. So I'm going one stitch to the left on our second piece of fabric here, and I'm running my needle down outward away from the cross stitching. I'm going to my first piece of fabric, and I'm going to the back stitch just to the left of that original center stitch that we first went through. So I went just one stitch to the left on both pieces of fabric, and I ran my needle through. Now I'm going to turn my needle and go the other direction, one stitch to the left of the stitches we just made. So one stitch to the left on the first piece of fabric and one stitch to the left on the second piece of fabric. And this is how we're going to sew the entire piece together. We're just going to move one stitch to the left on both pieces of fabric, running the needle either up or down depending on where you're at in your stitching. And this is a sort of ladder stitch, just constantly moving one stitch to the side, running up or down, and then changing directions and doing it again. We've reached our second corner, and I just kind of wanted to go over this again. So I have one more stitch left before I get to my actual corner. So I'm just going to work these stitches as I have been doing all the way around so far. And I'm now at my corner, and we're not going to treat the corner any different. We're just going to go one stitch to the left, which is our corner stitch, that diagonal stitch. I'm going through it. I'm going one stitch to the left of the back stitch on the other piece of fabric, and I'm just going to pull through. I'm just going to treat it like any other stitch. The problem with the corners is that now your fabric needs to start changing directions. So even though you're not going to do anything different, you're still just going to move one stitch to the left, one stitch to the left. Even though you're not doing anything different, these corners can be a little tricky because your fabric needs to change direction. So just continue moving one stitch to the left, but be patient. It's going to take a couple of stitches before the fabric really kind of turns and makes that corner. You might kind of have to adjust those stitches, tug on them a little bit, but you don't need to do anything different. Just keep working one stitch to the left, and pretty soon your fabric will just make the change that it needs to make, and your corner will be set, and then you can just continue on your way stitching. I've now stitched about 3/4 of the way around, and as you can see, we have that lovely Biscornu shape, nice and formed. But I want to stop here because I need to stuff this before we sew it up all the way. So you can use whatever stuffing you like, but it does need to be rather soft because we're going to actually be sewing through it. So I'm using polyfill. Again, you can use whatever you'd like, but we want to stuff it so that it is firm enough that the corners have good structure to them, but not so firm that when I squeeze the center, it's hard. We want to be able to squeeze that center. And this is because the final step of finishing is going to require us to pinch those center pieces. So I have my piece completed. I've stitched all the way around, and it has this amazing shape to it. And it's nice and plump. All the corners are sitting well, but it's still squishy. I can still squeeze it. And this is the final step of creating a Biscornu. We want to pinch these center pieces in. And the way we're going to do that is with 2 little buttons. So I have my first button, and I've loop started my thread onto this first button. And I'm just going to center it on my Biscornu. And I'm going to figure out approximately where the needle needs to go down so that the button is centered. And for me, it's just slightly off center. Now, this would be a lot easier if I did not use my regular tapestry needle. I tried to do this on camera, but it just got too hard. This would be way easier to do with a long sewing needle if you have one available. But if all you have is a tapestry needle like me, you can still do it. It's difficult, but it just requires you to really squeeze that Biscornu. You want to put the needle all the way through the cushion and have it exit on the back side. Again, just off-centered so that your button for the back side will sit centered. And I'm centering my button. I'm figuring out where the needle needs to go so that it does sit centered. And I'm going to put my needle back through the cushion because I want to return to that first button again. And I'm just going to work my way back and forth between these 2 buttons. I ended up going several times through each holes of the buttons, making sure to tighten the floss each step of the way. There's no set way, set amount that you need to tighten the center, but I liked mine to be quite pinched, so I tightened my floss pretty tight. And as you can see, it just created this nice little pinched Biscornu. I'm going to finish this one off by putting a couple of decorative straight pins in this. And with that, my Biscornu is complete. Now, I'm not going to be using this as a pin cushion because I think it's just too cute and I don't want to risk damaging it. But you absolutely can use Biscornus as pin cushions, or like me, you can just set it on a shelf and admire it. So that's it. That's how you create a Biscornu. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, and thanks for watching.